Hi everyone, this presentation is about how to do a DBA, or a document-based assessment. And we're trying to get the scariness of these assessments out from underneath you so that you have really an easy time mastering them and doing well at them. And a document-based assessment, it's simply what the word says, what the meaning says. You have a document, or two, or three, that questions or your assessment is based off of. So the questions that you have to deal with, you can always refer to the document or the reading that you are given to try to answer them. And then you also have to bring in your own background knowledge, what you know yourself. So step one in conquering the DBA is really understand every part of the reading that is given to you in the assessment. It's called a document-based assessment for a reason. If you can't understand the document or the reading that you're given, if you can't understand what they're saying or talking about or what they're feeling or anything like that, then you're going to have a bad time. And you ask questions like who, what, where, when, and why. And you do things like write on your document-based assessment, annotations, little notes that say, I don't get what this word means. Or I'm not sure I get what he's talking about in these sort of lines. Or maybe you try your hand at trying to summarize what he's talking about in this section. Finally, you might, on occasion, when you're reading a source text or a document, have to fill in the blanks. Have to say, okay, based on my reading, I don't get enough given to me explicitly, immediately in the reading. I have to take a guess as to an educated guess, a smart guess as to what this guy might be talking about. So sometimes the reading won't give you enough. The second step you have to do is understand the source note. And the source note is usually identified in your document with italics, with bold, either on top or on bottom. And you have an example of a source note here. When doing this, the key is not just put yourself in their shoes, like some teachers might say. The key is rather understand how a human being might react if they're, in the case of this one, Edward Waterhouse. So he works as a secretary for the Virginia Company and helped start Jamestown. So you know he works for the Virginia Company. Then you can think things like, okay, my dad works for a company or a job or a business. What are his motivations? What does he go to work every day and think about? And then you might come up with, hey, he thinks about pleasing his boss. He thinks about pleasing his business and company and doing well. That's the key. Because then you get a possible motivation for Edward Waterhouse. He's a secretary. He wants to make his Virginia company happy. He wants to contribute positively to it. So he might, maybe frame a more positive message to the company than a negative one, saying, as this source note suggests, he says the massacre was actually a good thing. So he's framing it. He's wanting to make it more positive, maybe, than it actually was. Finally, step 3. When doing a DBA, you have to understand what the question is asking you for. So, you have to basically understand the assessment part. What are you looking for? What do you need to find? For example, 1A, what rights does King Henry grant to John Cabot in source 1? When you read this, what you get at and what you're understanding or trying to understand, what the question is really asking you for, is find the rights in the text that King Henry grants John Cabot. This answer for 1A can be found entirely from the text, from the document that you're given. You don't need to search elsewhere. Secondly, for the second question that you see on the screen, think about King Henry's role in the age of exploration. Why might you trust him? Why might you not trust what he says? This requires you to both think about King Henry's role, which means that you have to bring to mind your knowledge of what you learned about King Henry in school. You have to know his role, and you can only do that by the knowledge given to you by your teachers in school. They teach you about who King Henry was, and they teach you about his role in the exploration. And so you bring that knowledge from class. But then, after this, you have to ask yourself, who was King Henry? And you have to do the same thing we did in step 2, which is not only put yourself in his shoes, but instead of thinking, as you might think as he might think. Think what he was all about. He was a boss man of England. He was in charge because he was king. He wanted his country to probably do well because he was king of a country. He was like the president who wants America to succeed. So, you have to think about those relationships a little bit instead of just coming at it as, what would I think if I was in his shoes? You have to think about, what would King Henry most likely think? You have to compare him to maybe someone in the modern day. Maybe you compare him to the president and sort of think about the things they have to deal with, the worries they have, and the wants they have. And finally, 2 other questions you might get is a corroboration question. In what ways does source 2 corroborate source 1? And that's a lot of the times it's just asking you to compare and contrast what is similar, what is different. Is one source actually saying, I agree with source 2, or are they completely on the opposite ends? And finally, this last one is reread the source note for source 2 and think about its strengths and weaknesses. So you're often tasked with determining if something was trustworthy and reliable. Can you trust the source? Can you understand it and believe it? And so this is what this question might ask you to do. And to do this question, you still have to you have to put yourself in the mind of whoever wrote the source note for source 2, and whoever's in there, and whoever wrote source 2. You have to put yourselves in their mind. What did they likely feel? What did they likely think? What did they likely want to do? And then you have to ask, what's missing? Do we get one perspective? Do we get 2 perspectives? Is it balanced? Is it just one point of view? Does he have an agenda? Do you think he has an agenda? Something he wants to get done? As you can see, you have to understand what the questions are asking for in order to know how to interact with the reading. Thank you. I hope this made the DBA easier.